Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christy Hubbard, and I'm the Senior Associate Director in the Office of Global Strategy and Initiatives. And today, along with the Center for Faculty Development and Excellence, we are bringing Peter Kerrigan from the DAAD. To speak with you today. This session is going to be about faculty opportunities through the German Academic Exchange Service. I'll let him say it in German, otherwise known as the DAAD, which is a private, publicly funded, self-governing organization of higher education institutions in Germany. DAAD promotes international academic relations and cooperation by offering mobility programs primarily for students and faculty, but also for administrators and others in the higher education realm. So DAAD offers opportunities that take scholars and researchers from many different disciplines and fields of study to German universities, libraries, archives, laboratories, etc., for research stays, guest lectureships, and more. Each year, the DAAD, its regional branch offices, its information centers, and its professors around the globe provide information and financial support to more than 120,000 highly qualified students and faculty for international research and study. And so it's our pleasure today to welcome Peter R. Kerrigan, who is the Deputy Director of DAAD New York and the Director of Marketing and Development for the organization. And in this presentation, you'll learn about teaching and research opportunities and hear tips on preparing your application. So without further ado, here's
Thank
Peter.
you. Can you hear me with this mic? Am I on? I think I am. Oh, let me pull this up a little higher. So I have to say it's nice. I flew in this morning from New York. It was 20 degrees in New York City this morning. So it's green, you have flowers, and this is very wonderful. So thank you for welcoming me with nature. You've just saved me, I think, the first 5 slides, so that's great. But let me just start again talking about the German Academic Exchange Service, so the Deutscher Akademischer Austausch Dienst in German for you. Just to start off by saying that our mandate here, our headquarters are in Bonn, and we have offices all over the world, which Christy said, and our regional office for the US and Canada is in New York, and we have a smaller office in Toronto and a smaller office in San Francisco. And we have opportunities for all of you and your students. So I'm not only going to talk about what's there for you, but since I assume most of you are working with students, I will, toward the end of the presentation, talk about some opportunities that are available that you can pass on to your students in an advising capacity. I think what's interesting to note about the organization, first of all, are our 2 mandates, one of which is to represent German higher education and research around the world, and the other is to represent and to run our very rich portfolio of scholarship and grant programs. And as Christy pointed out, we as alone fund over 120,000 people to go to and from Germany. I will talk about other organizations, all of which, including DAAD, are funded through various German ministries, which translates to the German taxpayer. But that's another conversation that's being held in Wisconsin today, I think. But we'll talk really about the funding that's out there for you. I like to say, for those of you familiar with the British Council, we're a combination of the Fulbright program and the British Council. So I've already talked about this. Just to give you a sense of where the offices are, where we have representation. I'm not going to belabor these 2 slides. That's generally what I use for the students of why to go to Germany. But perhaps I could ask you, how many of you been to Germany? All right, and in what capacity? Were you in Germany? So it was a tourism? Okay. Was anyone there for research? Okay. And oh, you were. Congratulations. I'll talk about the Humboldt Foundation in a moment. Thank you. Good person to know. Good person to know. Okay. And did you raise your hand? Yes. Wow, fantastic. Okay. Are there any Sorry? Oh, great. Thank you. Are there any DAD alumni in the room who've been funded by us? Oh, well, hopefully we'll change that then. Okay. So I'm just going to talk about just briefly, and for those of you who've been to Germany and have actually conducted research, we have at least two Humboldt fellows here, former fellows. You can chime in and talk about it. I think what's important to talk about, for those of you who are at the research stages of your career and looking around the room, I suspect most of you are as part of your teaching load, just to give you a sense of what the university looks like, where research is conducted, and then to talk about some of the funding agencies, not just my own. I hope that if you haven't seen this yet, these brochures are sitting out on the front desk, and they're also online. So I'll give you the URLs toward the end of the presentation if you want to save the paper. So just very briefly about the university structure in Germany, for those of you who haven't been there. Generally speaking, we have the university, which is similar in scope to the research university here in the US, meaning that the terminal degree is, in fact, the PhD. You have, what's not on the slide is the University of Applied Science, and as the name implies, the research that's done there tends to be more practically oriented or applied science. And the terminal degree tends to be the master's, although there have been some changes in Germany there as well. And other disciplines I won't go into, whether they be nursing or theater or architecture, take place in other universities as well. They're not integrated into the research university per se the way they are here. What's interesting to note here is where research in Germany takes place. So it takes place at the universities, both the universities of applied science and the universities, the research universities. Non-university institutions, research institutions like the Max Planck Society, for example, is probably the best known. Fraunhofer is another one. There are a whole series of institutions that not only conduct research, but can also confer PhDs, but I won't go into that. And then, like everywhere else, there is research that's funded by industry and by the federal government. So again, just to take it down a notch to look at what we like to call the research performing organizations in Germany. And I'll have to translate some of the German. I tried to translate it to English and the whole slide just ran amok. But if you look at where there's basic research versus applied research, for those of you who are making distinctions in what you do, just to get a sense of where it's happening vis-a-vis the funding. Public funding is here on the bottom left. Private funding is on the bottom right. The Länder is what translates to the state. So in this case, the state of Georgia would be the context. So if you're looking at applied research and looking for funding, really it's the state institutions that have the most funding. Going to the upper right-hand quadrant, looking at applied research vis-a-vis private funding, and you can see that's where you find where industrial research comes into play. One of the most heavily populated sectors is down here. We have basic research and public funding, which is what I'm talking about today. So you have the various associations I referred to as the non-university institutions, the universities themselves, the academies. Some of you were actually at an academy, Max Planck, et cetera. I'm just giving this, I'm not going to go in detail over this, just to give you a sense of the breadth of funding that is out there. Everything from the Alexander von Humboldt, and we have two former Humboldts, or Humboldtianas as they call themselves, here in the room who can talk about that. But what this really reflects is that there's funding for every level of the research career, whether it be an undergraduate, whether it be a graduate, whether it be a senior faculty member, whether it be to insert yourself in a research group, whether it means to start a research group in Germany in collaboration with a research group back home. And I'm just going to touch briefly on these three. Just in the US, we have a campaign that we call Research in Germany. And you'll see these oddly colored, but they're the colors of the German flag, Gerber daisies, the dahlias on the brochure. And we have a companion program for that called Study in Germany. And so these three organizations that are highlighted in this shade of pink have representation here in the US. And so we, DAAD, are in New York. The German Research Foundation has offices in New York and Washington. And the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation has a subsidiary called the American Friends of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Washington. And again, this is a very simple overview, but I just want to whet your appetite in terms of the amount of funding that's available for those of you interested in research. And just breaking it down just to give sort of one-word distinctions between the three organizations that come to this table. Start with my own DAD, and we really reflect the mobility of individuals across bilaterally between Germany and in this case, the US. The Alexander von Humboldt really focuses on the person as far as the research is concerned. And the DFG really funds research projects or research groups. Another distinction is that DAD, we as an organization will fund degrees and studies, which our partner organizations in this campaign will not, and I'll come to that in a moment. So I'm just going to talk about DAD now. If you're interested in learning more about the other organizations and you don't want to take the brochure, by all means, go on a website called Research in Germany. If you just Google Research in Germany, you'll get to it. But the official URL is research-in-germany.com and .org. But as I said, Research in Germany, and all that information is on there. As I mentioned, our organization, DAD, we fund all of you and all your students, basically, in every discipline. So I know we probably represent most disciplines on campus in this room, and that's good because we will fund you as well and your students. Generally speaking, our funding, some of the funding includes a travel stipend. Most of it includes costs of living on the ground, plus supplements for insurance, and sometimes travel reimbursements within Germany if you're invited to attend a DAD organized lecture or information series. And are there any, I know I'm meeting with some of the German faculty later. Are there any, is anyone here from the German department? Okay, good. Then I can say what I'm going to say, not have a guilty conscience. Because you don't need to speak German to go to Germany anymore. A lot of what I'm talking about is offered in the English language. However, like with everything else, when you're talking to your students, if you're advising them as well, if you do plan on spending some time in Germany, it's advisable to take the language, and we do have funding available to attend language courses. So let me just move ahead. Our website is daad.org, and it's organized by the faculty tab, faculty meaning faculty and postdocs in this concept. I'm not going to go over this whole list because that would bore you and probably bore me as well, but I will highlight some of the opportunities and then encourage you to go on our website and look for more. And please just stop me if you have any questions. I'm just going to keep going here. So as I mentioned, there's funding available for those of you who want to learn German. I won't go into greater depth here, but there's funding for you to actually go to Germany and spend up to 8 weeks to learn German in Germany. So to keep that in mind, if that's of interest to you, particularly for those of you who plan on doing longer-term research, and many of you who are in some of the humanities and religion, philosophy, the knowledge of the language, if you're going to do research in Germany, of course, would be quite handy. This again is for those of you who are advising. Is anyone here from do you have an art department here, musician? You do, from the music faculty or the art department before? Okay, then, yes, okay. So we have separate processes for the artists and musicians, and this is of course the exception in terms of how everything is done. All of our applications are submitted to our office in New York, and they are viewed by a selection committee comprised of faculty like yourselves from the US, Canada, and Germany, all representing the disciplines that are in that current round of applications, except for the artists and musicians. Their dossiers are assembled here, but then they are sent directly to Germany, and then they are judged by an international group of faculty members in those disciplines, and they are judged in a pool from applicants from all over the world. So the relationships in terms of outcomes are slightly different. The outcomes, generally speaking, for our applications here are between 1 out of 4 and 1 out of 6, depending upon the source. For the artists and musicians, it's slightly higher because they're being judged against a larger pool. In our case, it's US and Canadian students and faculty are judged together. So this is of interest. Let me I'll start with this one for you, for the faculty. There is funding for you to do short-term research in Germany, up to 3 months. Depending upon what you do, it depends upon whether or not you need to speak the language. But the idea is that you can choose a topic, apply through us for funding. In the application, demonstrate some sort of relationship with the potential host or the host that exists, to talk about the relationship that you have with that institution, why the research at that institution or archive or library makes sense. And you would submit that through us. We have 2 deadlines a year for these. Unfortunately, the May 1st deadline is not happening this year, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But generally speaking, next year we will have 2 deadlines again for research. And the idea is that you're really judged against not only your academic career, but demonstrating that the research that you're going to do really makes sense for what you're doing and how you've articulated that in your application. The main reason we're not having some of our our May deadlines this year is you probably are familiar with the influx of refugees in Germany right now. And what has happened is that DAAD has actually reallocated some of its resources and received a large infusion of euros from the federal government to help deal with the refugee scholars. There are 50,000 of them, roughly, who've landed on their shores in the last 11 months. And so the idea was, and this is where we've had to divert some of our resources to help process those scholars and students who've arrived with nothing, no credentials, and try to integrate them into the relevant and appropriate academic environment. So for a number of our scholarships, this is one of them. Unfortunately, if this is part of your planning for this year, we apologize profusely, but the circumstances are really extenuating this year. And hopefully next year we'll be back in our same rhythm. Just to talk about the terms of award, you'll see as I go through the slides that as you go sort of further down the academic chain, going down to undergraduates, the awards are less. So an undergraduate student would not receive an award, for example, of 2,100 euros per month to go and study in Germany, and I'll come to that a little later. So let me just backtrack here. For the postdocs, there's a similar research grant available for PhD candidates and postdocs. The length of stay is longer. It's actually up to 10 months in contrast to the faculty research grants, although we do have shorter term grants here as well. And that's for fewer than 6 months. But again, our May 15th deadline is not happening this year because of the same problem. We also have funding if you have any students at the master's level who are interested in pursuing a PhD in Germany. We have funding for that. And to keep in mind that for most universities and most graduate programs, there's still no tuition in Germany, even if you are an international student. So I know you don't want to lose your students, but certainly that's a selling point for students who are interested in pursuing a graduate degree. So there's funding if you have an established relationship or a relationship with a German university. There is funding through us for faculty exchanges. So in this case, for those of you who are interested in going to Germany to teach, there's something called the short-term lectureship, where the German university would apply on your behalf. And there's some matching involved in terms of it's not completely funded on the German side, but there's some matching as well. And you would receive from us, in addition to what you would receive from the universities, roughly $2,200 US per month for the length of your stay, which could be up to 6 months. These are really designed for teaching, not for research. The other grants are really designed for research. And this is the companion program to that. We're bringing German faculty to the US. Wait, did I just? Yes. I just switched slides, sorry. Oh, thank you. If I say I had to wake up at 4:30, is that an excuse? I don't know. Okay, there's another program I just want to touch on, and that's called RISE Worldwide. And that's a program, and I'm going to talk about the RISE programs later. But RISE, for those of you who are in the STEM fields, RISE is a program outbound, in this case from the US, for undergraduate and graduate students in science and engineering, predominantly in math, to go and get practical experience, in this case in Germany. It's funded through us, and I'll come to that a little later. There's a program where you, if you're interested in bringing undergraduate German students to your laboratories, there's a program for that as well, and they come funded. So you don't have to come up with any funding. You would just help them, insert them into a research lab or work with a PhD student, and they bring their funding. You don't really have to do anything. You just point them in the right direction. How do they find housing, et cetera. It's really meant for an independent student who is very interested in gaining international research experience. And the way that works is the databases go live, the database to submit proposals goes live in the fall. You submit a proposal, the German student applies on his or her end in Germany. The dossiers are assembled by my colleagues in Bonn. They're forwarded to you, and then you decide whether or not you want to interview them, and B, if you want to accept that student for your research lab. So again, there's a big list here. I'm just going to highlight a couple of programs as well. The two at the bottom, I think, are the most interesting, perhaps. The first one is we have, for those of you who are in different scientific disciplines, every year, toward the end of the calendar year, we have a structured tour of Germany called the Science Tour, aptly named, and the theme changes every year. So if I'm not mistaken, last year we had a tour that was focused on biomedical research, on research in medicine, et cetera. And we brought a group of scientists, administrators, faculty members from the US and Canada, took them to Germany, and we had a whole series of research institutions and administrators and funding organizations on the German side they met with. You have to come up with the transatlantic flight, but once you land, everything is funded by DAAD. So it's really, for those of you who are looking in terms of exploring your own knowledge of research, in this case in Germany, or looking to expand your research collaboration, this is a great program. We have something called the Group Study Visit, which is for those of you who are interested in learning more about German higher education in the European context. That group goes every June, and that theme changes. This year, we're actually looking at undergraduate and graduate education vis-a-vis employability, and looking at the German models for that in vocational training, and as well as other forms of education in Germany, and that group's going in June. So those themes change every year. Again, that theme, that is very similar. You have to come up with a transatlantic flight, but once you get there, everything is covered. For those of you who are, let me just put this up here. Those of you who are interested in looking at more collaboration at the university level, interdepartmental, there are a variety of funding opportunities. I'm not going to go into detail here, but please see me. I'll leave my card here, or you can go on our website. But I'll give you 3 letters to write down in Google, and that's PPP. And that's really a wonderful program, which is a German acronym. It's this long, I won't go into, but basically it translates into interdepartmental funding between Germany and the US. And some of the recent models have actually included a third country. So for those of you that are working on, and also looking at perhaps structuring a degree or a dual degree with other countries, you'd have to include Germany as part of the scheme. These are some great fundings. The bottom one I think is probably the most interesting, the research in Germany one, but DAAD.org as well. I'm going to go on to some more. Any questions? So the question was about the funding rate. So it really depends, it varies every year. And so it depends on how many applications we have for that year and how many people we can fund, because that changes every year as well. So sometimes we have more funding. This year, our numbers will probably be a little stricter because, as I mentioned, of the funding that's been diverted in Germany right now. But generally speaking, RISE is different. I'll come to that in a moment. But I think for the sake of your personal needs, it's between 1 and 4 and 1 and 6. depending, again, on the year. So comparatively speaking, it's really not bad, quite frankly. And I'm just going to touch, I'll just ask, are any of you working with undergraduate students before I? Okay, of course. Okay, so some of you, just to let your students know that there's funding for them to study abroad as an undergraduate. There's funding for them to do research abroad if they get credit for it when they come home. I'm sorry, research is part of their senior thesis, and there's funding for an internship if they get credit for it when they return home. So there are 3 possible avenues to utilize this funding. There's not a lot of funding at the undergraduate level for students to study abroad. So just to keep it in mind, this is, of course, Germany specific, but Fulbright comes into play, as you know, after they've graduated as an undergraduate. There are, of course, other schemes funded by the US government that help as well for studying abroad. This is a great program if any of you have students who are at the master's level or are interested in doing a master's abroad. So they can do, again, as I mentioned, there's no tuition. They could do a master's for free. And I guess for free is a misnomer because somebody's footing the bill, and that's generally the taxpayer in Germany. But for our purposes, it's tuition free. There are some minimal costs in terms of like a library card and registering. We're talking about maybe 150 euros for the semester. But generally speaking, they can apply for funding through us to help defray the cost of living once they're there. And again, you don't need to speak German for most of the graduate degrees being offered right now. There are over 1,900 degrees being offered in the English language in Germany. And we can thank the Dutch for that. They were the first country in Europe to do this, and then the Scandinavians followed suit. But of course, we don't say they shouldn't study German, but just to say that it has opened up doors, particularly for the scientists who might have been less likely to pursue a longer-term research stay in the German language, in the natural sciences, for example. So if you have students who are already matriculated here in a master's program, they can apply for funding to do part of their research in Germany as well, and that falls under this scheme as well. I've talked about this, pursuing a PhD. Let's talk about going back to some of the research grants for your PhD students. Are any of you postdocs in the room? Any PhD students in the room? Okay. Faculty, that's great. Okay, so I talked about this before, so I'm not going to go. This is just too much to read. We'll go through this. Going back to the RISE program, which are the scholarship programs or the internship programs both for undergraduates and graduates. In this case, this is the undergraduate program. This is for students who are either going into, in between the sophomore and junior year or the junior and senior years of their undergraduate degrees in engineering, science, some math, as long as it's related to chemistry, physics, geology, and earth sciences and biology. The way it works is that students apply in their around December or January of either their sophomore or junior years. There's a database of internships that goes live in December, and they can apply for up to 3 internships. Their dossiers are forwarded by my colleagues in Bonn to their potential host. The way it works is a PhD candidate has submitted a proposal to the database saying that he or she is willing to help host and to basically to mentor an undergraduate student from the US or Canada to work in that laboratory in the summer. And they come funded through us, not through you, and not through the host university. The student finds out roughly in February or March whether or not they've been accepted, and they decide whether or not they want to go. Well, I can't answer that. I can look into it for you. I know this is a program that was started initially, and the way the funding was secured was through these disciplines. But what we always say is that, for example, there have been psychology majors who were funded because they were focusing on something that was related. I had one student who was looking at pharmacology and chemistry, how related to brain waves. And so while it may not be in this cookie cutter model that we come up with directly addressed, there might be some internships where indirectly related disciplines are addressed. So I can't say it's across the board ruled out, but there might be in the course of an academic year some proposals that are put forward that might address a student who is straddling not specifically archaeology, but maybe with an archaeological slant and coming from a different perspective. So it's not in the pie chart, but it doesn't mean that it would be ruled out. And so the relationship here, going back to your question in terms of numbers, it really varies. Last year we had 2,100 applications for 300 slots. So the relationship was 1 to 7, 1 to 8. This year we have a couple of hundred fewer applications, so it's a roughly 1 to 6, I would say it's come down to. But it is by far one of our most competitive programs. So, and then the companion program for that, if you have graduate students, where they can actually go for up to, if you allow them, up to, well, it's up to 3 months for funding. And the research doesn't take place in the university setting, unlike the undergraduate program, but actually at a company working with an industry. And similar disciplines, the level of funding is a little higher because the idea is that they've reached a higher level in terms of their academic careers. And as I said, they can stay for up to 3 weeks. Again, for a majority of the internships, German is not required, but for some of them it is because they are working in a company setting. So I've touched very briefly on language learning, and I'm going to keep it brief, but just to suffice to say that at all levels, undergraduate, graduate, and also faculty, there is funding to learn German. So if that's your interest, if you have students, for example, at the undergraduate level who have a basic knowledge of German, they can actually take courses in German pursuing another discipline. So a political scientist, for example, could get funding through us to do a summer program in the German language looking at a political science or while attending a political science course. So it's not just for the linguists, it's for actually all disciplines that we have funding, not just to learn the language, but also to improve the language in the academic discipline from which that student or person comes. You would hone on the reading, and so you would choose, there's a whole list of language institutes that you would choose from and apply. So they've been vetted by DAAD in Bonn, and there's an agreement there in terms of the transfer of the finances, et cetera. But it's names like the Goethe Institute. I mean, they're well-established language, international language programs. And then you would choose the program that best suits your needs. So if the oral is not as important, the comprehension and the written make more sense, and you would choose a program that makes more sense for you. So I'm not, because all this is online, I'm just, again, just going back to this slide, and it was sort of brought up at the beginning in terms of putting together a successful application. And I think for this audience, you've probably been through this process, and I know just by the questions that many of you have been through probably very rigorous application processes for funding. So I'm not going to reiterate a lot of what you know, but I think particularly when passing it on to your students is really what they're looking for is why Germany, why that research institution, why that program, and how that makes sense for what you're doing and what you plan to do. And I think as long as that's clearly articulated and the academic track record is quite strong, and then the student should, or in your case, you should do okay. If you're working with undergraduate students and advising them, you'll notice on our application forms, there's a lot of information that would be considered the norm in the US, which is not allowed to be asked for in Germany. And so what we tell the students, that if there's a part of their narrative which is important, whether it be economic background, whether it be racial, whatever it is, whatever is part of their story that cannot be reflected in the application, we can't ask for religion, we can't ask for race, we don't ask for economic background, it's all merit-based, it's not need-based. So whatever is important to that story, that the student had to work 3 jobs, whatever it is, that can be reflected in this the letter that they submit, their proposal, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, they are being looked at by your peers at institutions in the US and Canada who understand what that means, who understand what the narrative is here, what our vernacular is in this part of the side of the Atlantic, and what is important for really looking holistically at the student or at the applicant they're judging. So that's something we try to pass on. And also for you as well. Of course, I'm not ruling you out. If there's something important to your story that needs to be reflected, then we ask that you do that. We are not allowed to release that because for those of you who speak German or are familiar with a lot of the European countries, there's a wonderful word, Datenschutz, and it's protection of data. And it's a struggle for me even to tell you that the relationship between how many applicants we fund, we got the green light for that. But whatever you're feeling, it's a very strong sense of protecting the individual and the data. That having been said, I can try to go back and see if we can, it's very, very exact. It's very sort of CIA-esque, I know, to go back and see if we can sort of at least whitewash and get, some of the letters for you. But generally speaking, not. But let me go bring that back because you're not the first to ask that, of course.
Federal agencies in the U.S. make those things available on the website.
I know. I know. So, but I hear you, and I'll bring the argument back again. There's funding for research. Yeah, so for some of and you actually pointed out correctly that for some of the funding schemes, they count the number of years since you've left your last degree, not even the PhD, depending upon it. And that varies from scholarship to scholarship. So, but generally speaking, at the faculty level, and you may have missed the slides, for the research that I talked about at the beginning, those are really not contingent upon how many years outside of your PhD you are. They are contingent upon the fact that you are on faculty at an accredited, which you are here, accredited university, in this case in the US. So that wouldn't come into play if you're looking for a research stay. I also, you missed at the beginning, I pointed out this brochure because the funding goes beyond DAAD. So there is a lot of funding that goes sort of higher up the academic chain. If you look, I don't know if any of you picked this up, but it's organized by every level through and including senior researchers, by the different organization that's providing the funding and what their requirements are. So I would say if you feel that you're no longer qualified or can participate, or your students in one of our funding schemes, it doesn't mean there isn't funding available. And so, and particularly since you're on faculty in law, that's not an issue at all. That you would have, yes, there would be. Through us, as you saw, the research funding is a little shorter in scheme, but there is funding available. Do you have a card? I can send you a link to the information. Or the question was about the level of German for a student who is applying, who has a connection in Germany for sure. It really depends on what the person's doing. We had, for example, a student who was studying Farsi, and one of the leading scholars in the world was in Hamburg. So obviously German wasn't necessary to do the research. So it's really very, in that sense, it's flexible. If German is required, if they're going into some archive where they need a command of the German language, and obviously that needs to be demonstrated. So Sanskrit, similar, okay. So no, that wouldn't be an issue. But that should be articulated in the letter. So the way we view it is wherever it's really where the student or the person has studied or is studying. So I'll work from the undergraduates and up. So if you have students or graduate students, undergrads or grad students, regardless of their passport, except for German, I'll come to that in a moment, if they have been in a degree program here in the US or here at Emory for at least 2 years, then they're eligible to apply through us. For postdocs, again, they would have to look at how far out they are from their last degree here. But if they're here as a postdoc, they should be able to apply through us. But what we tell students with non-US or Canadian passports is also to look at our offices abroad, because there might be other funding schemes that are still available to them, of which we know nothing about, because for example, within Asia or with Latin America, there are different funding schemes available that are not available to students here in the US and Canada. But it's really regardless of where their passport. And you'll see that in the RISE program, for example, the undergraduates, we did a survey and we saw that we had over 100 countries represented, even though they were coming from the US and Canada. So no, that's not in the interest. It's really to fund everyone. Yes, of course. If they're in Chile, they should check with our office in Santiago, because it gets, with the dual citizens, they have to decide which passport they're going to use to apply through. And as a German citizen, they may actually be eligible through some of the Erasmus schemes or the EU funding that a non-EU citizen would not be able to apply for. So I don't want to give information that's incorrect, but I would tell for anyone who has a dual nationality with an EU passport, also to look at what funding might be available through that, because there might be more. Through the EU, and the EU has an office in Washington as well, so they can look at their website. But there are some schemes. Now, they may have to demonstrate where they've been studying. But I would tell them to look at both, using both passports and see. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, thank you so much.